Final week of the fantasy football regular season. If you're watching this, you're either in the playoffs getting ready, competing for seeding in the playoffs, or need this win to get in. Let's get it. Welcome to the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andress. As always, be sure to like this video, comment below. If you have any fantasy football questions for Week 13, I'd be happy to answer them for you. Each and every week, we begin with Pick 'em Up, waiver wire options owned in less than 50% of leagues. We begin with Seattle running back Rashaad Penny, who emerged against the Eagles in Week 12 for 14 touches, 129 yards, and a touchdown. Compare that to Chris Carson, who only had 12 touches for 57 yards. It was a season high in touches for Penny. He hadn't seen more than 8 since Week 2. Next 3 weeks, he gets Minnesota, the Rams, and Carolina. That's 2 of 3 tough matchups, considering the Vikings and Rams are pretty solid. So this is somebody you shouldn't be starting quite yet, but his talent has league-winning upside, especially if Carson struggles down the stretch and they start to use Penny as much as they did in week number 12. Secondly, I like Darrel Williams of the Kansas City Chiefs, and this is contingent on Damian Williams missing Week 13. It's a mystery as to whether he's going to play this week at the time of this recording. He has a rib injury. If he were to miss time, Darrel Williams steps in and becomes a solid flex option in every single scoring format. Before the bye, he had 13 touches for 43 yards and a touchdown off the bench when Damian Williams went down with that rib injury. And in weeks 3 and 4, in a similar situation, Darrel Williams was the RB17 and RB11 when Damian Williams was also out due to injury. One more running back I like this week, Snell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. This guy's owned in less than 5% of leagues, widely available, and again contingent on whether or not James Conner plays in Week 13. But if he misses time, it was clear last week that Snell has moved ahead of Jalen Samuels on the Steelers' running back depth chart. His first game back from injury, Snell had 21 carries, 98 yards. He added a reception for 5 yards. Compare that to only 5 touches for Jalen Samuels. So again, his value is contingent on James Conner's return. But if Conner is out, Snell has Cleveland, Arizona, and Buffalo the next 3 weeks. Very attractive schedule, not only for the end of the fantasy regular season, but the fantasy postseason as well. And even if Conner comes back, Snell should still be rostered, considering Conner has not only missed games completely, but left games due to injury early more than one time this year. And one more honorable mention, Jonathan Williams. We mentioned him last week for the Indianapolis Colts, but this is now back-to-back 100-yard games. He scored in both of those games for the Colts. Marlon Mack's still out with a broken hand. He's still a viable option and owned in less than 50% of leagues as well. Moving on to the stream team for week number 13, quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses owned in less than 50% of leagues that you can not only pick up, but start as well due to matchups. And it's a repeat option again, this time for quarterbacks. Sam Darnold from the New York Jets. Now 3 straight weeks of 21-plus fantasy points against the Giants, Redskins, and Oakland. Not exactly a murderer's row of opponents, but this week, Cincinnati on the road. The Bengals top 3 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks at 21 plus per game. Darnold now 9 total touchdowns and just 1 interception in his last 3 games. Got to go a little bit deeper for my second streaming option for week 13. Nick Foles from the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, matchup dependent here, considering that Foles has failed to reach 18 fantasy points in either of his 2 games back from a broken collarbone. But this week he gets to take on Tampa Bay, who is basically the Miami Dolphins defense from earlier this year. That's how bad the Bucs defense has been. Tampa Bay's second most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season at 22 per game. But in the last 4 weeks, the Bucs have allowed 27 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Moving on to streaming tight ends, Ryan Griffin of the New York Jets, like his quarterback, also taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. It's a pristine matchup for Griffin, who has emerged with Chris Herndon now on IR. Griffin in his last 4 games without Herndon, 66 yards and 2 touchdowns, 50 yards, 109 yards and 1 touchdown. And then last week, 13 yards, but he did find the end zone. Griffin has been a top 3 tight end in 3 of those games, top 10 last week among tight ends. Cincinnati in the last 4 weeks, the most points allowed to tight ends in fantasy football at more than 22 per game. Secondly, Jacob Hollister of the Seattle Seahawks didn't do much last week, but if you actually watched the Eagles-Seahawks game, you know he was wide open in the end zone, and Russell Wilson had a moment we rarely see from him, just airmailing him over his head. Jacob Hollister would have found the end zone if not for that bad pass, and his 2 previous weeks before that had 12 catches combined for 99 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I still think Jacob Hollister is a viable option in week number 13. Honorable mention as well goes out to Jack Doyle of the Indianapolis Colts after news that Eric Ebron is now out for the season with ankle injuries. That means Doyle should get all of the tight end targets in Indianapolis. Moving on to streaming defenses owned in less than 50% of leagues. The Philadelphia Eagles this week get to take on the Miami Dolphins. It's not been the Eagles' defense that's been the issue in Philly. It's been their offense. In fact, the Eagles' defense has played extremely well. Now, 4 consecutive games of less than 20 points allowed, 3+ sacks in 3 of those 4 games. Last week against Seattle, 6 sacks and 2 turnovers forced. Miami's still number 1 in fantasy points allowed to defenses. Top 10 over the past month despite some of that improved play out of Ryan Fitzpatrick. But they are still a bad offense that isn't high scoring, tends to turn the ball over. So I still like Philadelphia in week number 13. Secondly, the Carolina Panthers. Again, a defense that has struggled of late, but a good matchup against the Washington Redskins in week number 13. Washington top 5 in fantasy points allowed to defenses. Carolina's D has had to face Aaron Rodgers, Matt Ryan, and Drew Brees in consecutive weeks. So that's really what we can attribute to their poor fantasy performances in that time span. This week against Dwayne Haskins, the rookie quarterback without many weapons around him. Kind of a different story here for the Panthers defense. So I'm going to put my faith back in them for week number 13 if you're looking for a streaming defense. Before we wrap up the show, time for Stealthy starts for week number 13. These are players that have been started in less than 50% of leagues in recent weeks, but you should have confidence in week number 13 despite some poor play of late. Tyler Boyd last week was started in less than 40% of leagues after he had just 3 targets, 1 catch, and only 10 yards in week number 11. Bounced back in week number 12 to go for 5 catches, 101 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets. So if you just draw a line through that 1 bad week he had and just throw it out, this is a wide receiver that's averaging 9.9 targets per game this season. And in week 13, he gets to take on the New York Jets, who have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. Secondly, Jaguars wide receiver Dede Westbrook, who has been quiet this season, hasn't really done much, had just 69 yards last week, but has another solid matchup this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And because it's the Bucs, you can trust Dede Westbrook in week number 13 if you're looking for a wide receiver 3 or a flex option. Started in less than 20% of leagues last week. But with those 69 yards came 8 receptions, so that was a solid PPR day for him. And Tampa Bay, most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers by a wide margin this season. In fact, 6 more fantasy points allowed to wide receivers per game than the next worst team. They are by far the worst defense and the best option when you have a wide receiver in fantasy football in 2019. Thank you so much for watching the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As we mentioned at the top of the show, any questions you have for Week 13, be sure to comment below. I would be happy to answer them for you. And best of luck in the final week of the fantasy regular season.